Good evening, colleagues, and a warm welcome to colleagues we have not met before. I'm Dr. David Mkwanazi, an occupational medical practitioner, exposure scientist, health professions educator, but most importantly, your colleague. Occupational Health and Exposure Sciences Academy's aim tonight, as always, is to save workers and strengthen industries by enriching you, the occupational health professional, with knowledge. This session is proudly brought to you by Occupational Health and Sciences and Exposure Sciences Academy. Please allow us to go through some house rules before we can start. This session is accredited for 1 clinical CPD point by HPCSA and for South African Nursing Council registered participants. South African Nursing Council attendees should contact Lebohang to guide them on how to upload their points. The CPD point will be allocated to colleagues who have subscribed, and colleagues still have the opportunity to finalize that with Lebohang before we submit to HPCSA and the Nursing Council. Colleagues who do not wish to receive CPD points are welcome to attend this session for free to enrich their knowledge. Kindly please drop your HPCSA number, South African Nursing Council number, or any other professional number with full names and email address in the chat box to register for CPDs if you are interested. For those who are not registered with HPCSA or Nursing Council, an attendance certificate will be issued to demonstrate your growing knowledge in areas covered by our platform. Please keep yourself muted at all times to avoid interrupting presenters. Disruptive attendees will be removed from the webinar and will not be able to join again. This session's attendance will be monitored for its entire duration to ensure full attendance. Kindly please ensure that you do not join using nicknames or handset device names to be properly identified and for your points to be allocated. Each session will be podcasted on YouTube for long-term education and training purposes. We have realized that many colleagues go back to our YouTube page to recap on the information that may have been missed during our sessions. We also urge you to post your questions on the video platform to continue empowering colleagues who will always be able to access our learning material. The link that you have used today for this session is a recurring link and can be used every month on the last Thursday of the month until the end of the year. Participants will be allowed to ask questions or comment after each session. And questions can be posted in the chat box as well anytime during or after the presentation. Our sessions are multidisciplinary in nature and meant to empower colleagues from different professional backgrounds. Kindly please be patient during the moments when we discuss topics that may not be relevant to you, but others. Our subscription packages, as mentioned, for 10 CPD points through our monthly last Thursday of the month webinars, you pay $500, which will give you 10 points in total. 2 of those points will be ethics. And then the second package involves the monthly refreshers also that we host every month for 3 hours, plus the webinar points for free throughout the year for those 10 months that we are active in. And all in all, you'll get 40 points in total. Sometimes it happens that you only need about 3 or 6 points. You can also speak to Lebohang to pay for specific sessions that you can attend on Saturdays to get the CPD points that you are looking for. Our upcoming webinars for this month, on the 18th of July, we will have a medical surveillance refresher. It's a session that we have had before. So we'll just be replaying it between 9 and 12 on the 18th. And then on the 25th of July, we'll be having, sorry, this is the presentation from last week. We'll be having TB management in the workplace on the 25th of July for 3 CPD points. This will be general CPD points, not ethical CPD. And then on the 30th of July, we will be hosting the monthly webinar on fitness to work criteria between 6 and 7 p.m. That will be a session like this one we are having today. Darren Joubert and Graham Bates or Graham Bates conclude in their 2008 peer-reviewed paper, which was published in Occupational Health Southern African Journal, titled Occupational Heat Exposure Part 2, the measurement of heat exposure, stress and strain in the occupational environment as follows. Many attempts over the years have been made to assess heat stress in the environment during a variety of different environmental and personal parameters and indices derived from this. To date, no single index has managed to incorporate all heat stress parameters into an easily applied and calculated index. The WBGT heat stress index is used in South Africa, yet too has limitations. The recent development of the TWL index, which has been based upon many of other indices and prior research, offers a simple to use index. Thermal work limit considers all of the required environmental parameters as well as workload, clothing, acclimatization status, and metabolic heat production to derive a single figure output which is easy to interpret. The indices limit, this indicates the limit of heating and cooling that is sustainable and will avoid heat-related disorders. The importance of fluid and electrolyte replacement and physiological monitoring of these cannot be overemphasized as an additional personal monitoring measure and should go hand in hand with environmental thermal control efforts and worker education. Please join us this evening as our speaker shares his knowledge and empowers us to approach our workplace environments with confidence and skills to make a difference. Welcome. So in today's session, we will discuss exposure assessment, analysis, and control with regards to heat stress in the workplace. And to help us navigate this hot topic expertly, with pun intended, we are honored to welcome Mr. Jerry Maimela, who is currently a mine ventilation engineer at Assmang Black Rock Mine Operations. He has Master of Science in Medicine, specializing in exposure science from Wits, MBA, Essentials in Business Administration, Management and Operations from London School of Economics and Political Science. He has Occupational Health and Safety Certification from University of Cape Town, Mine Environmental Control and Mine Ventilation Engineering from the South African Chamber of Mines, and he also has a certificate on Principles of Occupational Hygiene from OTA. OTA is an occupational hygiene academy. And then he has a bachelor in environmental management, environmental engineering, and environmental technology from University of Venda. He has a career spanning over 13 years and previously worked at Bokoni Platinum Mine in the following roles: environmental manager. Before that, he was an environmental coordinator, after being a shaft ventilation engineer, and before that, he was a shaft ventilation officer, after being an occupational hygiene technologist, and started at the same company or the same employer as an environmental assistant. We welcome you, Mr. Jerry. Are you here? Please, are you?
Yes,
All
you
right.
hear me, Mr. Dr. D? Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. We are happy to have you. We are honored. I'm trying to share your slides. If you could give me a moment, and then I'll be controlling your slides from my side. Can you see your slides?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much, Dr. D.
All right, you may proceed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Dr. D. And good evening, colleagues. Like they mentioned that I'm Jeremy Mela, currently in BlackRock Mine, as part of the Asmang Group, as the mine ventilation engineer, specifically as an underground mine. That's what we are doing here. So I'm gonna just share with you some few knowledge in terms of heat stress management. And I concur that some of our colleagues they actually also know the subject. And I think I was just privileged to be the one who will be sharing this knowledge today. And you are welcome to can ask any question or discuss any other challenges which you have in your operations, and we can see how can we assist each other. Of which, like Dr. D just indicated, that we are a group of colleagues here, professionals. We are in this space of occupational medicine, occupational exposure, environmental health, environmental management, ventilation engineering. But we are the same colleague, and that's why it's important that we share this information. So I'll just be discussing few slides on exposure and also the measurements, the analysis, and also the control. Also just touching base on the physiological part of things. The objective for this presentation, like what has been indicated, is to firstly to define what is actually the heat stress exposure frameworks and explain the measurements techniques and tools which have been used in different industries, taking into cognizance that we are actually from different industries here, and also demonstrating the data analysis and interpretation on when can someone just go through the data and interpret it and make sense out of it, because I think that's what actually makes our profession to be interesting. And also just to present the heat stress gradings, to say what kind of gradings do we have, what kind of method are we having, and how can we interpret those results based on the gradings so that they can be visible and be understandable to any other layman or any other colleagues in our industries. But also very important is actually to align our controls with those measured risk which we found in the space. So that's the objective for this presentation today. You can go to another slide, Dr. D. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think the biggest question can be to say, actually, what is this heat stress concept? What are we talking about when we are speaking about the heat stress? In simple terms, it's actually about the heat balance equation, whereby it's about the heat storage, which is actually equals to metabolic heat and actually plus environmental heat. So it's actually your internal core heat and also the environmental heat, which is actually within the surrounding, but again, also minus the heat loss. So we just made these simple calculations that we can make. Of course, I believe it's actually going to be what we'll be speaking about, that your core heat, your environmental heat, and also minus the heat loss, whereby if one is actually above each another one, you might have issues. If you can lose that heat, which you actually accumulated from the environment, but also from your metabolic heat and you can't lose it, then you're going to have issues. Then that's where we result having the heat stress. Factors which contribute to this is actually a number of factors. It's actually the environmental factors, the personal factors, but also the occupational factors, which they are there, which contribute to this metabolic and environmental minus heat loss. Whereby in the environmental, we have air temperature, humidity, air velocity, radiant heat. They become important because they determine the environment which you are operating in. And those are the kind of conditions which will actually, together with your metabolic heat, and if you don't have more heat loss, you're going to be having issue of heat stress. And from the personal part, the factors includes the acclimatization. There are people who are struggling with acclimatization, of which is actually a natural thing from any person. It's not something that you can develop or you can try to acquire from somewhere. It's just natural how our body are and how we are naturally been born. But also the fitness part of things is also contributing. But also one of the important is actually the hydration part, to say how hydrated are you, and with that determine still part of those metabolic heat and the heat of the environment contributing. But something which is also important, especially in our workplaces, is the work rate, to say what kind of work are you doing. As in the mining industry, we do most of the hard works. And if you are doing that, what kind of conditions are actually being presented to you so that you can be able to lose that heat, not store it within you. Because if you do that, then that's where we're going to result with heat stress. But also the PPE is very, very important part, because if you insulate the heat within you, still there will be heat accumulation within the boxed environment, and that on its own, together with your metabolic heat, depending on the work rate that you'll be doing. And if you don't have good heat loss, we're going to have the heat stress. So I just wanted to unpack the heat stress, that we can just understand it in a simpler method, and I hope that's actually better outlined there. Dr. D, you can go to another slide. Thank you. Still speaking to the heat stress and trying to explain it, also just trying to simplify it. The question is to say, what is actually the heat stress? They say it's the net heat burden on the body from the combination of body heat generated while working, environmental sources, and clothing requirements. Is basically what I was actually explaining there. Just here is more elaborative and elaborated more. What are we speaking about if we must do a risk assessment? This heat stress actually increase, or the risk of heat stress increase if in that environment which you are, you don't have any breeze, you don't have any wind, you don't have any ventilation. In mining industry, we use mostly the ventilation as the concept, but in different environment, you might use the breeze or wind or air. That's basically meaning airflow within that space, microenvironment which you are working. But again, of what important is also the kind of heat or the kind of sources of heat which are actually surrounding you, like the radiant heat, which you might get it from the boilers or from the furnaces industries, mostly in the manufacturing industry or especially in the smelting industries. But something which is also important is actually the high humidity. If we have high humidity, it's mostly telling us to say the cooling capacity of the air within that microenvironment is not enough to can cool you. So it means that heat loss will be impacted. And if it's impacted, we are having the risk of heat stress. But again, also touching the hot objects. You might be touching different hot objects, which that on its own can cause the heat stress or burning. But again, using the bulky or non-breathable PPE. Sometimes we say PPE can be a solution, but sometimes a PPE can be also a risk. Depending on some kind of PPE which you are using, in certain environment, you might also be contributing to the heat stress risk. But again, also working into the direct sunlight. This is actually where people are working in the outside environment, in the open pits, or maybe in the roads or in the construction industries. That's where most of the people are being actually exposed to the sunlight. So depending on the ambient temperature in that area and ambient air within that area, you can be impacted, especially if you don't have the shades to alleviate the risk. But also the hot weather, especially us here in Northern Cape, we are actually suffering to those kind of weathers, especially when you go into the Namaqualands. You tend to find high temperatures in those areas, and they actually contributing to the risk of heat stress. Strenuous activities, this is where you are doing a lot of hard labor, because with that, then tend to increase your metabolic rate, and also the core temperature increases. And if that increase, obviously, and if you don't have good ventilation or good airflow to cool you down, you'll be experiencing the heat stress. Thanks, Dr. D. Next slide. Thank you. So the question remains to say, it's fine, we understand that there is a heat stress, but how do you go about assessing this stressor in different environment or in different settings? There are some kind of like a stepwise exposure assessment, which we know as colleagues, and if you do follow them, in most cases you might identify what is actually the risk, and as part of the risk assessment, which we do in everyday basis, whereby first you start with the hazard identification to say what kind of hazard are here and what actually this hazard which are actually contributing towards the heat stress. But again, what also the environmental monitoring, what kind of environment are we working in as the colleagues, or again, what kind of environment is actually our colleagues working into? So that on its own also tells you the story. But again, after that, you do the worker profiling to say, what are these workers doing, their daily activities? How much energy are they using? How much energy are they, how many times are they actually resting, or for how long duration are they resting? And then you go again, you say, okay, it's fine. We understand to say they are doing this kind of work. This is the kind of environment these people are working in. And these are some of the hazards which they were actually identifying as part of the contributing factors. But then we do the quantification. I think that's what we do better as occupational hygienists or the environmental health practitioners. Quantification, so that we can know and we can classify the risk which we're actually experiencing in that setting. But again, of much importance is for us understanding the environment, but coming up with the controls that we can implement to ensure all the hazards which we identified in that environmental setting and being our employees being exposed to, and how much is that? Then what can we do? Then we put in the controls, different controls, applying the hierarchy of controls, of course. But that's just basically the stepwise exposure assessment which you might do in different settings. Dr. D, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I think here we just wanted to elaborate it more in terms of hazard identification, to say typically heat stress hazards. What kind? We do have the next slide, which actually elaborate more, or also elaborating that. So in different settings or in different industries, you tend to have different kind of heat stressors hazards, especially in deep level mining, whereby you have things called the high geothermal heat gradient. This is actually based on something called the VRT, the virgin rock temperature. Different rocks tend to have different temperatures when you are going deep, and with that's actually the contributing part into the heat stress as part of the hazard. You also have things called the auto compression. You also have things like called the TMMs. These are just trackless mobile machineries which we are using underground for trimming or for as part of our operational. With that, then that also results into the present the heat stress hazards, but also the high humidity environment. Because, like I said, if you have high humid environment, you tend to have low cooling capacity or a specific cooling. With that, we are presenting the hazard of the heat stress, but also the radiant heat sources such as finances and the smelters, like I indicated, but also the outdoor solar exposure for our colleagues who are actually working in the high temperature environment outside in construction industries. Next slide. In this slide, we are just actually elaborating more in terms of hazard identification to say in mining industry, what actually is actually the hazard is, like I said, is the geothermal heat gradient, and you also have the machineries which we are using, but also poor ventilation underground. That on its own is actually presenting the high humidity environment and also low circulation. That on its own present the heat stress risk. This is actually mostly in the deep level underground mine, and whereby some people they are wearing also the heavy PPEs or they are doing highly physical work, because that's still contributing into that equation which I actually presented before. Typically, with this, you'll have the heat exhaustion, you'll have dehydration, but also fatigue. And the risk is mostly high in deep environment, in deep mining environment. You will find high risk of this, and that's why they employ ventilation engineers so that we can engineer the whole the hazard. But also on manufacturing industry or the smelters, whereby you do have the furnaces or the molten materials, and also the radiant heat from different sources within the industry, whereby we're doing a lot of smelting. We are doing a lot of contact, actually been contact with a lot of high heat, and actually more of like a radiant heat in terms of the dry bulb heat. It's a more sensible heat that you're actually feeling. And that on its own, the exposure conditions might be indoor hot works, because in mostly they're actually enclosed environment, but also limited cooling. If you don't have good ventilation circulation in that environment, you'll obviously have the risk or the hazard of heat stress, whereby you can experience the heat cramps, the heat fatigue, and the risk is high in those kind of environment, especially if you are ventilation cooling, your cooling is not good. You don't have, you also have high temperatures in that area, and also highly elevated humidity. Obviously, you'll be having issues in that area. But also the construction industry. Our colleagues, they are mostly working in a solar radiant heat outside there. In most cases, they are doing, that's what they are doing. They are constructing buildings, they are constructing the roads for us, but they are also being exposed to their heat stress hazard. Because in most cases they're working in the outdoor, like I indicated, but they're also doing a heavy manual labor. That on its own, like I said, it increases your your core metabolic temperature. And with that, because when you're doing a heavy duties, of course, your metabolism goes high. And if the environment is also not conducive, is high temperatures, and maybe in other areas highly humid, then if you don't have good cooling, which is actually the velocity or the wind or the breeze, then it means you're going to experience the heat stress. Then that we are also a risk of heat stroke and dehydration, which is also very high. Even our agricultural setting, our colleagues there, they're always being exposed to sun, and humidity is also an issue. They're working long hours outdoors with limited shade, because in agriculture, it's actually an open field. So with that, then you tend to experience a lot of heat exhaustion as part of the health risk in that setting. But going also to transport and logistics, if in those areas you don't have good ventilation and also the engine heating in those areas, because most they actually like an enclosed environment. If you don't have good ventilation in that area or the cooling, obviously you'll be experiencing the heat stress because the areas or the vehicles, they are mostly confined. And also when you are loading or unloading, those areas, they actually been confined in those vehicles. And if you don't have those good coolants, you'll experience the heat stress and the fatigue. But lastly, is actually our firefighting and our emergency services, whereby these people, their work is to extinguish the fire. So they are mostly directly impacted and actually working with the radiant heat, and also their PPE. It's actually more like insulated PPE. And if those people, they are working in those areas for extreme time because their work is actually been working into extreme heat, we know we do a lot of acclimatization for the firefighting when we are training them so that they can be. Actually, we need people who are actually more can acclimatize so quickly. And with that, like I said, it's actually a natural thing which you can develop, but you can always train to can be in that kind of a situation. But unfortunately, you can experience some severe heat strain because you're actually highly exposed in that environment. Then of course, the risk is actually extreme in that setting. So this was just showing the hazard identification and some kind of the heat sources which you might have in different settings, and what kind of exposures are those and conditions which can present the heat stress for you and the risk in that effect. So this will be part of like when we are doing a hazard identification in different settings. I just wanted to elaborate more into different environmental setting. Next slide. Dr. T? Okay. Thank you. Yes, I know I spoke about the heat stress, and we spoke about all these kind of environmental settings which we are working, and as part of the stepwise exposure assessment. But the question might be to say, why must we care? Why must we care about all those things which are there? We do care because the heat stress on its own, it affects our body. There are some health effects which you can also develop from being exposed to heat stress. First is actually the mild one, which might be the sweating, more sweating, you feeling thirsty, you fatigue, your head, feeling some headaches. Those are actually the early symptoms which you might experience as part of the health risk which are there. And that's why you need to be careful as the environmental specialist or a hygienist or environmental health practitioner or medical occupational medical practitioner or working in certain setting. You must be alert and you must care about that because you do have some health effects which can be coming from that heat exposure. But there are also some moderate ones whereby someone can be feeling some muscle cramps, some dizziness while working, some weakness or reduced concentration while working. Because when you are working in high heat environment, your concentration tend to be reduced. And that I think Dr. D and other colleagues from occupational medicine, they will actually understand it better. Those are actually the symptoms which they're telling you as the environmental practitioner or the hygienist to say you must act, you must do something about that. It's either you advise people to do a lot of hydration or a regular some resting in some other areas. So there are a number of things that we can be doing, but I think those will be what we'll be discussing more when we are doing the controls. But there are also severe effects whereby you can start feeling the heat exhaustion, the confusion, and the loss of consciousness, or even the heat stroke, which is actually like a medical emergency. That's actually becoming more serious, and that can also result into fatal if you don't get a good attention or some irreversible situation which you might actually experience. Because the heat stroke on its own is actually the highest of the heat stress effects that you might get in different environment, because there you're having your height, the temperature being above your core temperature, and also maybe the environment within you is actually high, and you don't even lose any air because you don't have any velocities. Then with that, then you might have like the hot skin, rapid pulse, then you are affecting the whole system of yours. So that's where we'll need to act more and also ensure we save life, because we might lose life. So that is actually the highest. So we are caring about the stress because of these effects, which might be if we don't control the stress. Next slide, please. Thank you. Going back to the heat stress exposure assessment, like I indicated to say, we are caring because this can result into high health effects, and we have identified to say we actually have these hazards in different environment. The question might be to say, how do you do this assessment? How do you go about identifying if we do have the risk in our workplace? We do have different levels of assessment. The first one, being level 1, is more of qualitative assessment, whereby you can do the walkthroughs using the checklist, just walking around as an expert in hygiene or in occupational, different occupational health practitioners. You go around the environment which you are working, or the occupational environment that you are working. Either is the road construction, either is in the mining industry, either is in the manufacturing industry. You just walk around, you'll be identifying some of the heat stressors or heat stress hazards which they actually been around your workplace. And with that, you can start observing some kind of also the workload intensity of your workers. What are they doing in physicality? But also checking if there is any current controls which are in place. Maybe it's actually in an industrial environment whereby you have furnaces. Do we have like the LEV, the local exhaust ventilation around? Is it from qualitative point of view? Can you feel it if you are walking around? Or are you feeling some kind of also some stresses on you? That will be the level 1. But us as occupational hygienists, we know that's actually like the first part of the risk assessment. We go certain level further, which is actually level 2. This is more of a qualitative risk assessment or quantitative measurements. Excuse me, I said the qualitative. I meant to say quantitative measurements. Because this, you can use different instruments to measure and quantify it. In most cases, we are using the WBGT, the World Bulk Globe Temperature Index. But also, we also, in some, especially us in the mining industry, we are actually also using a thermal work limit together with the temperatures, both the dry bulb and wet bulb. Why dry bulb and wet bulb? Because in the mining, they're actually giving us something we called the cooling capacity of the air. That is like the specific cooling capacity, of which is actually important. Why is that important? Because it tells you to say, if these people are doing this kind of work and having this kind of environment be presented to them as part of the heat load, but if we have this kind of ambient air coming into the environment at these temperatures, it means it actually have this kind of specific cooling capacity, which actually gives you a comfort to say it will indeed cool your workers. But also, humidity is also important in different environmental settings, and also in mining industries. It's very, very important factor, humidity, because, like I said, if you become to a situation whereby you have high saturation, it means the wet bulb and the dry bulb, they're actually equal. Wet bulb being the latent heat, and dry bulb being sensible heat. So if those ones are equal, it means you're actually 100% humid. So in that sense, it means your air can't do any cooling. So we're actually telling you to say you're actually having a risk. But also the wind speed. Wind speed, it can be either velocity, it can either be the wind speed outside in the construction, or wind speed from also the LEV in a different industrial setting. That's still also being the airflow, which becomes important, but also the sun exposure. So together, all these parameters, they actually tells you to say, is our environment conducive for people to work, or is not conducive for our people to work? Then that quantification will also tell you to say, what must you do based on your grading or your risk classification, which I think will actually more presented in the next slides. So level 3 is actually more of the OMP, the occupational, and also the occupational health practitioners. This is actually their field, they know it better, but it's also a level which needs to be undertaken and also checked. Why is that? Because that's why they are tracking your heart rate, which is still being affected by the heat stress, but also your core temperature and also your blood pressures in the extreme environment. So this when just some kind of higher level whereby the occupational medical practitioners, they're assisting us as the hygienists, because in most cases we end up in level 2, and that's why we need them to assist us, and that's why we are part of the occupational health. Second slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. As part of the level 2, still continue, we, as occupational hygienists or the ventilation engineers or environmental health practitioners or exposure scientists, we rely mostly on the instruments, different instruments for different stressors. For heat stress, the one which we are using mostly is the dry bulb temperature, like more of like the core parameters which we are checking. It's the dry bulb temperature, the wet bulb temperature, the globe temperature, and the air velocity. Together, all these, they can also give you the humidity of the surroundings to say what kind of surroundings that. And this is just a list of the instruments which we are using in different settings. The next slide will actually show you in some pictures, so that those who are not familiar with them, they can also just visualize to say what kind of instrument are we talking about. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so like I just said before, these are just actually the same instruments, but here they're actually more visible because we just try to, so that we can visualize them and you can see them, like the wet bulb, the WBGT, which is different instruments. Sometimes we do have the WBGT meter, but we also have the vein anemometer or the anemometer for air velocities, and we also have the globe thermometer alone. You can also have it alone, being like to check the black body, of which is actually the highest attraction of the sunlight, or the sling psychrometer. This is just to measure your air temperature, your humidity, your radiant heat, and your air movement around you. In mostly the WBGT, we are actually using it mostly at outdoor work, in the construction area, in the open pits, in any surface open environment, but also in the industrial environment, in the finances and the smelters, and also different manufacturing. But we're also using it also in the mining industry. Underground, we are using the WBGT. We are also using the vein anemometer. We are using also the wheeling hygrometer, being some of the instruments which we are using just to measure temperature, humidity, radiant heat, and air movement. But we are also, especially in our deep underground mines, we are also using something we called thermal work limit. Thermal work limit, we use it because it tends to incorporate the workloads part of things, because it's actually measured in watts per square meter to say how much work is this person doing, and if he's doing this kind of work in this kind of environmental setting, what kind of stressors are we going to experience? Because sometimes the WBGT tend to give only some limit, it has some limitations, whereby the TWL tells you how hard can a person safely work in an environment. So in most strenuous environment, like underground, in deep level operations, we tend to prefer to use it, but also because it can also give you some analysis when you are actually having like a good software to give you to say, as a ventilation engineer or as a occupational hygienist, these are the conditions which your people are working, and this kind of work which they are doing, and when they are doing this kind of work. So for how long can they do that? And if they're working that hard, can they cope for a certain time? And if they can't, what can you do? What can you put in place? But also the heat index, of which I think this one, we know it, just basically about the WBGT and the Vane anemometer, but measuring the air temperature and relative humidity, and also they're using the hygrometer. So this is just part of those simple kind of measuring parameters or techniques which we use. So these are actually mostly used techniques to measure the heat stress in different environmental settings. There might be others, but these are actually more the core part of those. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, we elaborated to say you'll use different instruments to measure different environmental settings, and that on its own is actually it's a question to say, if you want to measure that, then what must you do with that? So this is just a table which actually explains to say what must happen, because if you are using the WBGT to measure different environmental settings, you must at least have some kind of, to say, like we call it OEL in most cases, but it's actually to say what range can we comfortably say people they can work there. It might just be not 100% controlling the whole situation, but it's actually like a limited normal exposure. Dr. D will tell you to say in exposure science, we are saying the OELs, they're based on a perfect person, which is actually 70 years, or which is actually 70 kilograms. And also that person is actually eating healthy, like a normal ideal person, which in most cases we don't have those kind of people. But just to make it simple so that we can have some kind of grading, we say the green is if the WBGT reading is actually 28, between 28 and 29.4. We say that's actually like a low moderate risk. Normal work can continue, but you must be cautious because it's actually closer to, it's actually above the 27.5 that we put in place to say if you are say 27.5 WBGT, you are safe. But when you are on those regions, then you say maybe you don't really need to acclimatize people, but you can do some hydration. It can work. And also have the yellow, which is 29.5 to 31. So we say it's moderate to high risk. Then whereby if it's active, we must be like some good active monitoring to see if the people they're experiencing those health risks which we spoke about, but also enforcing the hydration and also like the administrative control of the start, work, and rest cycles. That's part of you being cautious as occupational hygiene practitioner or the ventilation engineer. But the rate is when you are on 31 going high, whereby you're saying, no, any strenuous work here, it must be stopped, or we must actually have new workers in that environment. You tend to reduce the workload, because the workload, if you have high workload, like I said, you have high core temperature. And if you have high core temperature, and because your environment is actually high, then if you can have high velocities to make the heat loss, then you're going to actually be experiencing some issues. But you can also put in the medical monitoring to check the heart rate, the different parameters which our colleagues from occupational medicine, they are checking. But the list is actually the black. We are saying anything above or equals 32.2, it's actually more extreme. It's stop any non-essential work, and you tend to see which work can you do, and which work is actually critical, which one is not critical, and what kind of continuous monitoring that you need to do, because as hygienists, you must make sure you can manage those health risks. Because in some environmental settings, it's not that simple. You can just say stop everything, but you can be also conscious to say which one must continue, which one must not continue. Here on the components measured, we were just showing to say we said we are doing the dry bulb temperatures, we are doing the wet bulb temperatures. What are we actually saying? So this is just a simple calculus of the WBGT in an outdoor environment when you do have to calculate it. But sometimes we have good instruments in these days. You don't need to do any calculations. You can also just get the reading and use the reading for determining if you are actually having a high risk, low risk, or medium risk. Thanks. Next slide, please, Dr. D. So this one just actually showing the thermal work limit, like I said, is to say what kind of hard work is this people, how hard can a person safely work in this environment? Because environment is being presented based on the temperature, the velocity in that area, and what kind of the cooling capacity do we have? So which work can continue? Whereby if when you are measuring your thermal work limit, it gives you above 220 watts per square meter. You don't really need to restrict any work. It's a low risk, people they can work. But when it's actually going down, that's where you become worried, because this just also tells you to say the maximum safe metabolic work rate that a worker can sustain without exceeding the safe core body temperature and the sweat limit. This becomes very, very important, especially with us in the mining environment where we are doing very hard job. We then need to be cognizant of that to say, is our people still go able to can work in this kind of environment? When someone making it a simple, this TWL, they're saying if a water is flowing into the bucket, it's caused by heat produced by your body. And also if the water flowing out of your bucket is actually a heat loss through sweating and airflow. If that there is any one which is actually more faster than the other, there's no balance, you're going to have issues. If the bucket overflows, you're going to have issues. If your body overheats, it's like an engine. If it's overheating, then you can't do anything about that. And unfortunately, you'll be experiencing the heat stress risk, especially in the mining environment, but also in the construction area whereby people are doing more heavy jobs. It's actually important to can also go further than the WBGT and you do the thermal work limit classifications. That just actually tells you can present you the risk and what controls must you put in place. Next slide, please. Thanks. I think I was actually explaining what I just explained before about the analysis to say, after all those measurements that you did for different parameters, so what must happen? You did measure your environmental parameters, you did calculate your heat stress index, either using WBGT or TWL, and you also maybe adjusted your clothing in terms of kind of PPE which you are using for your work, but also the work intensity, to say you reduce the work intensity which your employees are doing, or you know about the work intensity which your people are doing. So you tend to, the last step will be like comparing those exposure which you have in terms of your employees in different environmental settings or environmental microenvironment. Then you tend to check against the OELs. That's what we usually say, or the exposure limit. Then you tend to classify the risk. So this is just like a step-by-step analysis of the results to say you have identified the hazard, you measured the hazard, then you did calculate the WBGT is giving you certain rating, and again you also consider things like the core metabolic influences, which is actually about the clothing or your PPE. Again, you know the kind of work your people are doing at different rate, which people they are doing your work. Then you tend to compare with the limits. Then you classify. You say, okay, this is actually my work environment, and this is the risk which actually being presented to me. Then it's a question to say, then what? Next slide, please. Thank you. I think here is actually the part where Dr. D and his colleagues, they come in, especially in the occupational health setting, both the OMP and also the occupational health nurse. We, as the occupational hygienists or environmental practitioners, we assess the environment for them. We know the environment, what kind of a situation or microenvironment are we working at, and we are presenting these results. But there is also, like I said, the further step, which is actually a more physiological assessment about the heart rate and other kind of different mechanisms which they're using to assess or to do the medical surveillance. Then after that, we can have like a decision-making mechanism whereby we can come together as a team to say, this is the environment, this is the physiological parameters which people are having, especially in other settings like in the mining industry. What do we do first? We have something we called RFA, whereby our occupational therapists, they do things in slang language they call it muchongolo. That is just to determine your heart rate and to say physiologically can you really work in a deep environment, in deep mine environment, and be walking for a distance, working, doing some hard work. Can you really do that? Then with that, it's like elimination kind of mechanism, so that we don't allow apologies to say, allow people who are not fit to come into the system. That's just part of the controls which are there. And that's where you come into agreement as occupational hygienist and also the occupational medical practitioner to say, this is going to be our elimination criteria because we know the kind of environment which we are working in. That's just to elaborate more, is usually integrating the environmental and the medical data, whereby you correlate the heat measurements and the physiological responses of someone. Then that's on its own, it's like part of your medical surveillance, whereby there's some core temperatures being checked, and the trends, the heat rate, and also you can also go to more biological assessment using the urine's concentration and to say what kind of what colors and those kind of parameters. I think Dr. D and his colleagues, they understand this kind of field more, this part of the assessment more. You can go to next slide, please. Thank you. I think this is just actually elaborating on the level 3 part, the physiological monitoring, which I think I spoke about, just showing to say in different settings, what kind of monitorings are they doing, what kind of tools are they using. But in the next session, that's where Dr. D and his colleagues will actually be telling us more about this part. Thank you. Next slide. This is the last part of our assessment, whereby after understanding everything, we put in the controls, following, of course, the hierarchy of controls. Some of the controls which we can put in place in terms of engineering is actually the ventilation or the air conditioning or the shielding, mostly in the furnace areas or the manufacturing areas. We tend to use those. But you can also have some kind of hydration, which is more of administrative, encourage people to drink more water, and also the rest part, whereby you intermediate resting and work rest, and also using the shades in different settings. But also the PPE becomes important, whereby you tend to use more of lighter PPE and more of colored, so that they can reflect the heat than instead of absorbing the heat. So that we can have some safe settings. Next slide, please. Yes, this just is actually elaborating more on the controls, but here we just try to make them to be into a hierarchy of controls, whereby you having the internet controls, basically modifying the environment to reduce the heat source. Administrative control, change the way people work to reduce the heat exposure. Personal controls, which is also the protective part, protect the worker and support the body. This is either using the body fluid, more hydration, encouraging using the lighter PPEs, or using some cooling garments, especially in the furnaces, whereby we are having a more radiant heat temperature, or having like the aluminum shielding in the furnaces or in the smelters. That's where you have more of radiant heat. But that's on its own. It's just to make sure you collaborate all of this, because they actually mostly work together than one being implemented and the other being not implemented. Just to ensure we eliminate the heat, we control the exposure, but we protect our workers. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the last part. I see our time has elapsed. This is the last part, just showing that the occupational health and safety is actually regulated in South Africa, depending of different settings which you are in. It's actually regulated. It's either you are on the industrial part, you have the Department of Employment and Labor guidelines, and also in the mining, you have mine health and safety, both council standards, but also you have DMRE, which is actually enforcing Mine Health and Safety Act. That's just to elaborate, but they're talking the same language, because what they are saying to say, one, assess the heat hazard, identify and evaluate the heat hazard in the workplace and task, monitor worker exposure, implement controls, provide medical surveillance, train your employees on the hazards and the control measures and the emergency response. So this, unfortunately, the compliance is not optional in South Africa. It's actually a legal duty to the employer for the employer to protect the worker, prevent the illness, and avoid any penalties, because you might have those penalties. Especially as in the mining industry, we know best that we actually been affected. If the MRE comes, you're gonna lose millions in within a week. Uh, but basically, what we are saying is saying, let's build a culture of good safety, and we can improve the performance, but also meet the legal requirements or obligations which we have as the employers. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, thanks. In conclusion, apologies. Yeah, in conclusion, what we are saying is we are saying his stress can be managed, but we just need to have like a good stress management framework, whereby you can have you can be able to can identify and you recognize that heat hazards that is actually available within your setting, but also be able to can measure and quantify it so that you can know you can make it more science based or engineering based. Then you assess depending on your risk matrix. Then you can identify if you're actually having a hazard, you're having a risk, or you don't have a risk. If you do have a risk, then you put in the controls, different controls, still following the same thing that we know, which is hierarchy of controls. You put in place, but after that, the most important part is actually the review of your controls. Is actually if they are actually effective and they're actually alleviating the hazard which we have, or eliminating the hazard which we have, if you are lucky. But this continuous cycle for a safer, healthier workplace is very, very important. That we keep our workers hydrated, but also involved, and the rest they stay cool, they stay safe. I think that's ultimately our goal as occupational hygiene practitioners or specialists. That's actually comes to the end of my presentation. I hope it was audible enough. And yeah, thank you so much, Dr. D, for assisting. Next slide. Yes, we can. I don't know if you have time for the questions or any concerns, but thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Dr.
Uh,
D, over to you.
yes, sir. Thank you very much for quite an insightful presentation. We have two questions. I think the first one, colleagues, I'm just borrowing you 5 minutes. I know this is critical time for families. So the first question is, please briefly explain the difference between ambient heat and radiant heat for colleagues who may not be aware.
Okay, so you're saying I can just come now?
Yes, just the difference between ambient heat and radiant heat that we encounter
Okay.
in the workplace.
Okay, no, thanks. I think just to simplify it is to say the radiant heat is actually the heat which is actually coming from the direct sources. The direct sources meaning some of the operational environment or some of the operational settings whereby you have the furnaces. The furnaces they tend to release the radiant heat more of like a heat contact or a heat convection kind of setting, while the ambient heat is actually a heat from the sun, because the ambient just means the outside environment. So that heat is more sensible, but we tend to measure it using the black body, that heat, because we believe that's where your your short wave radiation comes in, because it's actually your like of your UV radiation, which is actually coming from the sun, and that's why we concentrate it to the black body, because that's will be something which will actually be attracting it. So that's the outside, the ambient one being just the outside heat coming from the sun, but the radiant heat being actually coming from the furnaces in most cases, or any heat source, even the fire. When you are burning a fire, the heat which you're experiencing through convection and also conduction is actually the radiant heat, because it's actually radiating that heat. So I think just in simple terms, but you can also get it to more scientific.
No,
Thank you, Dr.
thank you very much. And the last question from Mr. Mukwena. Good evening, colleagues. My question is regarding unique occupations like such as sporting. The trend we see now in soccer matches, where soccer players have to take water breaks, clearly shows that heat stress is managed. Would the decision also to have Comrades Marathon in winter the same reason to manage heat hazard, or is it just a coincidence in your opinion? Remember, these people are also at work. I know they look like they are playing most of the time, but they're actually being paid to do what they're doing, especially in soccer. I'm sure those who've been watching World Cup have noticed that after 22 minutes or so, there will be a break for people to take some water and then they continue. All right, over to you, Mr. Maimela, and then we close.
No, thank you, Dr. G. I think it's a very interesting question. But when we are answering it, it's just basically uh, an awareness, which actually are around different working, like you just indicated, Dr. T, the workstations, whereby people they understand that we actually having the heat stress. Why in soccer? I think it's actually more explanatory, because we are sweating a lot, so there is a lot of metabolic heat being generated, and if you don't hydrate, of course, it won't be cooling those engines. But another thing which I actually experienced is to say the stadiums also they had the air conditioners. That's also just appreciating the effect of the air velocities, because when you see the stadium is actually mostly enclosed, then if you have any ventilation or any air velocity surrounding, so you're actually increasing that heat loss. But increasing the heat loss, like I said, with the equation is to say the metabolic rate plus the environmental conditions minus the heat loss. I think that's why they bring in the good hydration. For the Comrade Marathon, I think maybe it was coincidence, but it's actually a good coincidence because also they are working, but the environment become more conducive because running Comrade Marathon like I had is actually one of the strenuous things you can ever do in the world this far because they're actually running through the steep that on its own is increasing your metabolic heat, but also straining your muscles because you'll need a lot of hydration so that you will know about the electrolytes and other stuff. But that's on its own. If you're not really losing, the environment is not conducive, you're going to be actually experiencing a lot of the stress in that area. Maybe winter is actually a good time. I don't know if it's a coincidence or it was intentional, but it's actually a good environmental setting. Thank you, Dr. D.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Maimela. And I think Eleanor Muluko shares the same sentiments by saying thank you very much for the information. And on that note, colleagues, I would like us to close it here and meet again on the 30th of July when we'll be discussing fitness to work criteria. Please have yourself a wonderful evening with your families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. T.